Good afternoon. My name is Paul Reier. I am the Director of Scholar Programs here at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the last colloquium presentation for the 2022 to 2023 academic year. Special thanks today to the Paloheimo Foundation for having sponsored the fellowship, and to Daniel Marians of UBS Financial Services for also having supported this program. Today's colloquium presenter is Robert Weiner, a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder in archaeology and anthropology. Rob is the Paloheimo Fellow for this year, and his talk today is titled, "It Shows My Way, Roads, Religion, and Power in the Chaco World." Welcome, Rob.
I would like to thank the School for Advanced Research and the Paloheimo Foundation for the truly precious opportunity to reside and write here amongst such an inspiring setting in my beloved hometown of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the ancestral lands of Tewa people who call this place Ogapoge Owinge, the White Shell Water Place. For starting, I'd also like to thank and acknowledge my dissertation committee, led by Scott Ortman, Kathy Cameron, Steve Lexon, Tim Pocketat, and Dimitri Nakasis, as well as a number of colleagues who have been particularly helpful in this research: John Stein, Rich Friedman, Taft Blackhorse, Clara Kelly, and Anna Sofer. Before beginning, I also wish to acknowledge the Pueblo and Diné descendants of the inhabitants of Chaco Canyon and the larger Chaco world, who have stewarded and ensured the well-being of these lands since time immemorial, and for whom the ancestral sites I will describe today live on as places of great significance and power. Finally, I wish to express my gratitude to the Navajo Nation Heritage and Historic Preservation Department for supporting my research on Chacoan roads throughout Diné Bekeya over the last 5 years. Ahiyehe. On the night of October 20th, 1927, archaeologist Neil Judd sat down for a conversation with Hastine Bial, a Navajo elder who had grown up in Chaco Canyon. Judd was interested in what Navajo people living near Chaco knew about the history of the place he was excavating, and as such, he was urged to seek out Hastine Bial, quote, described as the oldest Navajo on the eastern part of the reservation, totally blind but possessed of an unusually keen memory, end quote. That evening, Bial, who lived south of Chaco near Crown Point, stopped to rest for the night in Chaco Canyon when returning home from attending a dance north of Chaco, where he and Judd finally met. Judd reports that, quote, fatigue, a good supper, and low fire in the crowded hogan, end quote, perfectly cozy conditions, almost inhibited a conversation. But by around 9 p.m., Bial's energy had revived, and a discussion began that lasted into the deep hours of the night. Bial explained through his son Frank, who served as an interpreter, that he had been born near Bears Ears in southeastern Utah and moved to Chaco around the age of 9 or 10. He discussed various aspects of Chaco's environment with Judd, including changes in the vegetation and rainfall of the canyon since his childhood, and his family's movements between home sites on a yearly basis. After discussing a number of topics, Judd's inquiries turned to a matter that had been puzzling him: the traces of wide, linear avenues he had seen throughout Chaco Canyon during his years excavating at Pueblo Bonito. Judd records that, quote, when asked about the so-called roads on both the north and south cliffs, Bial remarked that they were not really roads, although they looked like them, end quote. Roads that were not really roads? What did Hastine Bial mean by this enigmatic statement? We're given only minor hints of what Judd might have learned about the non-roads of Chaco in his conversation with Hastine Bial. Judd later stated his intentions to dedicate an entire monograph to what he called Chaco's, quote, ceremonial highways, end quote. But unfortunately, such a project was never completed prior to his passing. In many ways, my dissertation project is an attempt to illuminate what Hastine Bial meant in telling Neil Judd that Chacoan roads were not really roads, although they looked like them. Here, I will offer a brief review of some of the major findings of my investigations over the past 5 years, exploring where Chacoan roads lead, how they were used, and how these questions shed light on the larger history of Chaco Canyon and ancestral Four Corners society. My discussion is organized around four foci: powers, places, materials, and practices that anchor this exploration of Chacoan roads. But first, some brief background. Chaco Canyon was an incredible center of religion and politics in northwestern New Mexico that reached its greatest prominence between AD 800 and 1200, though the canyon was the setting of many histories before and after these 4 centuries as well. Chaco is located in the center of the San Juan Basin, a harsh environment where rain is not only little, but both patchy and unpredictable. Within the basin today, Chaco is among the harshest environments, with, on average, only 20 centimeters of rainfall a year, less than half of the annual precipitation along the basin's mountainous margins, and a precariously short growing season reduced by an entire month from the basin's margins. Yet it was here, in Chaco, that ancestral Four Corners people constructed monumental masonry architecture at a truly awe-inspiring scale. Construction on Pueblo Bonito, shown in this image, began in the mid-AD 800s and continued for approximately 400 years, developing in its final stage to be a truly monumental structure that stood 4 stories tall and contained at least 600 rooms. Throughout the 1000s and 1100s, a series of great house structures were constructed throughout the canyon, purposefully situated and built according to an ordered set of geometric plans incorporating angles and alignments to solar and lunar events, resulting in an overarching architectonic plan of astronomical significance. Furthermore, all great houses in Chaco Canyon are associated with at least one Chacoan road, consisting of a 9-meter or 30-foot wide avenue, often marked in the canyon via elaborate staircases carved into the living rock of the towering sandstone cliff face. The inhabitants of great houses were healthier than the people living in small house sites scattered throughout Chaco Canyon. And great house dwellers were an elite class who accumulated massive quantities of turquoise and shell, along with exotic goods of Mesoamerican origin, such as cacao, macaws, and copper bells. Those interred in Pueblo Bonito amongst such opulence were members of a single matrilineal lineage spanning 300 years. Prestige and influence in the Chaco world, it would seem, was inherited, and appears to have been established within particular families as early as the 9th century. The construction of great houses in Chaco Canyon required immense amounts of labor and resources. At least 240,000 timbers were carried to Chaco by foot from the Chusca, Zuni, and San Mateo mountains to build great houses. Along with construction costs, Chacoan elites also imported much of their pottery, some, or perhaps much, of which contained imported foodstuffs that supported Chaco's elites and the massive building projects undertaken in the canyon. Chaco's influence extended across a vast region of 100,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Ohio, that encompassed portions of all 4 corner states, including New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. Chaco-style great houses appear in approximately 150 communities throughout this larger world. As documented by archaeologists Mike Marshall, John Stein, Rich Luce, Andrew Fowler, and others, these so-called outlier great houses are frequently surrounded by low earthworks, punctuated by broad linear Chacoan roads that emanate out into the landscape. Big questions loom in Chaco research. Why did the Chacoans build big, not only in the form of monumental masonry great houses, but the colossal roadways that almost always accompany these ritual structures? Why, and how, did the elite inhabitants of Chaco acquire prestige and influence to marshal labor forces to build great houses and roads, acquire immense quantities of turquoise and Mesoamerican exotica, and maintain such privileges within family lineages? And what drove people across the ancient 4 corners to build Chaco-style religious architecture and contribute material goods and labor to doings in the canyon? The story I will tell today addresses many of these questions through the specific vantage offered by Chacoan roads, 9-meter-wide earthen avenues that radiate from great houses within Chaco Canyon and at the 150 communities throughout its larger world. 3 of these roads are long-distance corridors spanning the San Juan Basin, one heading due north, one to the southwest, and one to the east. But the majority of Chacoan roads are short spokes of only a kilometer or less that could not be associated with a clear destination in the last large-scale study of Chacoan roads by the Bureau of Land Management in the 1970s and 80s. Chacoan roads run across the landscape as straight as a sunbeam and ignore topographic obstacles, plunging straight down sheer canyon drops or coursing directly over mesa tops, as you can see in this example of the South Road. Their monumental width is hardly explicable through practical necessity in the ancestral Four Corners, where societies lacked wheeled vehicles or pack animals. Previous research by John Stein, Mike Marshall, and Anna Sofer offered initial clues illuminating Hosteen Bial's statements that these features were, quote, not really roads, end quote. These early projects found that Chacoan roads sometimes connect great houses with each other, but even more frequently lead to striking places in the landscape of water, earth, and stone. Indeed, rather than leading to obvious resource areas or large habitation sites, the most common architectural features found along Chacoan roads are herraduras, crescent-shaped masonry features whose locations on high points with panoramic vistas indicate they're best interpreted as shrines or blessing places. Roads also point towards astronomical events and connect non-contemporaneous structures, linking buildings and people via, quote, time bridges, to use John Stein and Andrew Fowler's wonderful phrase. Hardly, it would seem, are these the highways of today. These pioneering studies were foundational to subsequent Chacoan roads research, including my project, but in many ways they've been taken as the last word on Chacoan roads. Their findings raise major questions about the principles driving social transformation, regional organization, and monumental labor efforts in an early complex North American society. For example, why should roads lead to places in the landscape or sites that were already ancient in Chacoan times? Why were Chacoan roads so wide? Should all roads really be considered the same type of feature? And, most centrally to my project, how were they used? Much has changed in the intervening 4 decades since these pioneering efforts. For one, mapping and remote sensing technologies have advanced immensely. It is truly impressive to consider that the BLM Chaco Roads project took place before the advent of GPS in archaeology, not to mention GIS, LiDAR, drone mapping, and the other technological wonders of today that have revolutionized our ability to find and document Chacoan roads. Second, archaeological and anthropological interpretive frameworks have expanded, including the recognition that greater dialogue and collaboration with descendant indigenous peoples is beneficial and not an antagonistic process. Indeed, there have been few recent attempts to integrate the empirical record of Chacoan roads on the ground with perspectives from the worldviews of descendant Diné and Pueblo people to consider the big questions of Chacoan monumentality, inequality, and regional influence sketched above. Here, I will offer some broad results of my attempts to do so. Consider the following statements shared publicly by Pueblo and Diné descendants of the Chaco people. Indigenous people know their own histories, and archaeological narratives of Chaco must take such knowledge seriously. The quotes I share here all emphasize that Chaco was a place of great power. Certainly, these insights of Pueblo and Diné histories of Chaco are resonant with aspects of Chacoan archaeology reviewed above: monumental architecture, the accumulation of goods, the organization of vast labor forces, astronomical knowledge. But how are we to understand such power? There is, of course, a long tradition of theorizing power within the humanistic and social sciences, bringing to mind names such as Karl Marx, Michel Foucault, Stephen Lukes, and Michael Mann. Yet, to rely too heavily on such authors from the Western European world is, I suspect, to miss key aspects of what is implicated in the use of the word power as employed in the indigenous contexts quoted above. In many native contexts, the word power, or source language equivalence, refers to the potency of holy beings, places, and forces that can be accessed by certain human beings via specific ceremonial practices and undertakings. Thus, Vine Deloria Jr. explains, quote, "Almost any tribe can be examined, and the result will be a bevy of stories about how the people used spiritual powers to live. And these powers are almost always made available to us in a sacred place where time and space do not define the terms of the experience, end quote. Similarly, Paula Gunn Allen of Laguna Pueblo shares that, quote, the word sacred, like the words power and medicine, has a very different meaning to tribal people than to members of technological societies, end quote, with these words referring to, quote, something that is filled with an intangible but very real power or force, for good or bad, end quote. She continues, quote, sacred, power, and medicine are related terms. Having power means being able to use this extra force without being harmed by it. This is a particular talent that human beings possess to greater or lesser degree. Power can be used only by certain persons, under certain conditions, and for certain purposes, end quote. To give a more specific example from the indigenous U.S. Southwest, for Diné people, there are certain places throughout the landscape where the Diné, the holy people, or spiritual divinities of great power, whose outer forms may be mountains, animals, bodies of water, astronomical bodies, are more readily accessible. Humans can connect with the holy people and their power at these places and leverage these blessings towards ensuring beauty, health, and well-being in various ways. For instance, one might visit specific holy places or might conduct ceremonial practices that evoke the power of particular holy people towards restoring hojo, harmony or balance. Indigenous histories of Chaco would seem to suggest that leaders in Chacoan society were distinguished by special abilities or knowledge with regards to the harnessing of power in the sense reviewed above, the potency of beings and forces that can cause change in the world, whether bringing rainfall or healing spiritual and physical illness. Notions of spiritual power and the manipulation of the natural forces may defy contemporary secular naturalistic ontological apprehension. Yet indigenous histories of Chaco and wider engagement with the histories of Native Americans and other extra-modern peoples throughout world history reveal that power in the sense of religious acuity is frequently the means by which certain people and groups come to be recognized as leaders, and thus occupies a prominent role in the transformation of countless cultural histories. Indeed, in a review of influential Native American leaders from the early 19th century, Timothy Pocketat found that, quote, religious figures were as likely, perhaps more so, to alter the cultural histories of other Native people or to consolidate leadership authority as were more overtly political leaders or war captains, end quote. Thus, power, in the sense of authority, legitimacy, and social influence, is frequently inseparable from power in the sense of sacred places, powers, and access to them. Pueblo and Diné histories certainly indicate this was the case at Chaco. Ancestral Southwestern practices and beliefs associated with the leveraging of power at Chaco are, I suggest, legitimately conceptualized as religion, a concept that has come under much scrutiny in recent scholarship of the ancient North American past, best exemplified in Severin Fowles' 2013 work in Archaeology of Doings, written here at SAR. I've been criticized for using the term religion and continue to welcome conversations with Native and non-Native colleagues regarding the applicability of religion to Chacoan society. It goes without saying that the practices and architecture of engaging power in pre-colonial North America are not the same as modern Christianities or other well-known so-called world religions, frequently and spuriously conceptualized as a sphere of activity set apart from daily life and politics. While I understand the baggage accompanying the word religion, I have found no suitable substitute for the compelling social force driving the construction of Chacoan great houses and roads throughout the Four Corners 1,000 years ago. Thus, in my dissertation, I refer not to a vaguely conceived Chaco phenomenon, something scholars have long discussed as underlain by ritual legitimization, but rather a Chacoan religious movement, in the sense of a set of beliefs, practices, and architectural forms that facilitated particular ways of engaging with and harnessing power as emphasized in native histories of Chaco. Religions are not something in the head, but are put into practice through songs and prayers, bodily movements, objects, architecture, crafting, fasting, dance, and other sensory experiences in material forms. if, as I suggest, the regional influence of Chacoan architectural styles, the mass importation of goods to Chaco Canyon, and the establishment of influential family lineages all derived from the establishment of a compelling Chacoan religion, then such a religion was not some abstract set of ideas, but a bundle of lived, experienced, and materialized places, practices, and architecture. In the case of Chacoan roads, religion was literally carved into the landscape through colossal labor efforts in which some members of society excavated the ground with digging sticks and others directed these massive undertakings, resulting in highly visible, enduring inscriptions on the earth. We can now see how within this framework, Chacoan roads, the places they lead, the entities they engage, and the acts carried out upon them were Chacoan religion, and consequently, at the very heart of why and how Chacoan histories of drastic social transformation developed as they did. Let us now turn to consider two Chacoan roads from my dissertation fieldwork, the places they lead and the entities they engage. First, we will travel to the south of Chaco Canyon near current-day Grants, New Mexico, to what is known as the Gasco Herradura, one of, if not the largest herradura known in the Chaco world. There are two parallel roads, each approximately 9 meters wide, in the vicinity of Gasco. These roads begin at a small, inconspicuous masonry structure, now eroded to destruction by a small rill with an associated small ceramic assemblage. The lack of any substantial midden deposit at the site suggests it was likely not a residence, but rather a small room or rooms that served as a specialized type of road-related architecture, and, specifically, a structure that marked the point from which their parallel westward tracks split. I call these small buildings road rooms. From the road room, the northern road segment runs directly to the Gasco Herradura, flanked by a massive rubble berm as it runs alongside the Herradura. There is an opening in the Herradura adjacent to the roadway, suggesting that those moving along the roadway may have entered its stone enclosure, perhaps to deposit offerings, make prayers, or other ceremonies as part of movement along the road. This road segment continues off the hillside and vanishes in the flats below, though its trajectory, if projected, leads directly to Blue Jay, a small Chaco greathouse in the valley beyond. The southern road segment runs just 30 meters uphill from the Gasco Herradura, where a single line of stones blocks its path, perhaps closing the road or otherwise signaling a place where those moving along it should pause. Such lines of stones across Chacoan roads are common at the sites I documented for my dissertation, and I call them gates. From the gate, the southern road forks again, with one segment running down the hill slope via a cut and fill segment, and the other passing in a narrow natural corridor framed by rock outcrops. These road segments rejoin and ascend a low hillside 110 meters away, where the road is clearly visible as a cleared and bermed pathway leading to a small herradura on the hill's high point. Looking east from this smaller herradura, the road swale is clearly visible cut into the hilltop. This swale frames a view of the mountain known as Tzotzil in Diné Bizad, Kaweshtima in Acoma, or Mount Taylor in English. The Diné, sacred mountain of the south, also highly significant to Acoma and other pueblos. Notably, one prominent upright stone in the gate across the road is clearly visible, seeming as if to mark an observation point. It turns out that, viewed from the small herradura, the winter solstice sun will rise directly behind Tzotzil along the alignment of the road. This alignment is also evidenced at the large Gasco Herradura, where the road's trajectory runs on a dramatic alignment towards Tzotzil, conforming with the sun's position at winter solstice sunrise. Following the Gasco southern parallel road's trajectory towards Tzotzil and the winter solstice sun, one arrives in 6.5 kilometers to the head of an unnamed drainage. Such locales are frequently watery places, the locations of seeps, springs, and water-loving plants. The road may continue down the drainage to meet up with a road heading north-northwest from the Haystack Greathouse, but this connection has not yet been confirmed. It can now be seen how the Gasco Road engages multiple places and entities of power. Tzotzil, a place of great blessing and spiritual significance to Diné and Pueblo people today, was surely also a place of power in the Chaco world. And indeed, the alignments of various roads and great houses throughout the San Juan Basin towards Tzotzil reinforce its significance. Not only does the Gasco Road inscribe an alignment into the earth from a massive shrine site towards the mountain, but the trajectory of this monumental line also corresponds with the southernmost point in the yearly transit of the sun. Not some lifeless object of scientific study, but an animate, powerful entity that brings light, growth, and life. Additionally, the drainage head to which the road ultimately leads is a watery place. And, as we know, for native peoples of the desert southwest especially, to e ina, water is life, a sacred entity to be cherished and protected. To traverse the Gasco Road, perhaps in ritual processions as described near the end of this talk, and to make offerings and prayers along its route, would have connected those so engaged with the powers of Tzotzil, the solstice sun, and water. The parallel routes seen at the Gasco Road recall other paired segments of Chacoan roads, such as along the Great North Road. What purpose and meaning, archaeologists have long wondered, would such parallel routes serve? I have learned from Taft Blackhorse that a central tenet of Diné Ika, a term roughly translatable as sacred schematics, is the notion of balanced male and female forms, or bikai do ba'adi. This principle is readily observed in the balanced presence of male and female deities in sand paintings, as Mother Earth and Father Sky, but also in the stars, where Cassiopeia, a female form, and Ursa Major, a male form, rotate around Polaris, their fire, throughout the year. The necessity of complementary male and female forms is an integral aspect of Diné worldview and ceremonialism, and, it would appear, of certain Chacoan roads. Balanced dualism is, of course, also a significant element in Pueblo traditions, as well as in many cultures across the globe. We will now travel to a place known as Yava De La Mano, located near current-day Crown Point along the 50-kilometer south road that emanates from South Gap in Chaco Canyon to eventually terminate at an herradura on the Dutton Plateau, offering a sweeping and dramatic view towards Ake Da Nastane, or Hosta Butte, a sacred peak to Diné people today and surely to the Chacoans a millennium ago. Yava De La Mano consists of an earthen platform ascended by a stairway, multiple herraduras, and a variety of small architectural features. Notably, Yava De La Mano is the last location along the south road from which Ake Da Nastane, or Hosta Butte, is visible, barely peeking over the horizon of the Dutton Plateau. And this visual fact is almost certainly the reason the platform was constructed in this location. As the road approaches the platform from the north, a small masonry box is present alongside the road, along with a concentration of ceramic sherds, likely deposited as offerings. From here, the road passes between a series of beguiling, seemingly anthropogenic rock outcrops that frame a linear corridor, with spurs connecting to the platform and herradura. The platform provides access to an embayment bench above, which contains small masonry walls and, most prominently, a small sandstone boulder on the otherwise cleared bench. This boulder, while ultimately originating from the cliff face, appears to have been purposefully placed in its current position, situated conspicuously on the otherwise empty bench. Upon closer inspection, the boulder is found to be filled with fossils from an ancient beach deposit, with a layer of cracked mud set between sandstone layers filled with fragmentary bivalve shells. Various features of Yava De La Mano's natural setting afforded it significance as a powerful place. First, as previously noted, it is the last location on the South Road from which Ake Da Nastane is visible, suggesting it may have been a place to make offerings or otherwise acknowledge the trapezoidal butte marking the southern edge of the San Juan Basin, and perhaps rains coming from the south. Second, parallel rows of circular rock outcrops that look as if they were created by human hands but were not, provided an auspicious, naturally manifested road. Their seemingly anthropogenic appearance may have been associated with past eras, traces of bygone times. Finally, the fossil boulder positioned prominently but in a restricted setting behind the Yava De La Mano platform suggests the traces of an ancient watery past contained within it were a significant locale for those moving along Chaco's South Road. Finally, there's good evidence that Yava De La Mano was established around AD 600, maybe 700, during the Basket Maker III period, approximately 400 years prior to the height of monumental architecture in Chaco Canyon. 1/3 of the Yava De La Mano assemblage dates to the Basket Maker III period, and Soso, a moderately sized basket maker village located on the mesa top above, is the only nearby settlement. It seems highly unlikely, if not impossible, that 1/3 of Yava De La Mano's ceramics would have arrived in their present location by eroding approximately 150 meters from Soso on the mesa top above and running perpendicularly to the natural erosion channels. The Yava De La Mano platform consists of piling earth and arranging sandstone clasts, architectural techniques well within the purview of Basket Maker III populations. From Yava De La Mano, the South Road proceeds to Kinya'a, a multi-component site most often associated with its Chaco-era Great House and Tower Kiva. But Kinya'a also contains a substantial Basket Maker III component, including a Basket Maker III Great Kiva that is the destination of one segment of the South Road. Indeed, the last 4 sites along the South Road are Basket Maker III in date. While current interpretations suggest the South Road was an 11th century Chacoan construction, I find it far more likely that this southernmost segment of the South Road originated as an earlier creation, linking multiple Basket Maker III era habitation sites with the earthen platform at Yava De La Mano and, ultimately, the Great Kivas at Kinya'a. The notion that formalized processional roadways to Great Kivas existed during Basket Maker III is supported by the repeated Basket Maker and Pueblo I rock art motif of lines of humans and other beings processing in straight lines towards large circular places. Thus, it would seem Yava De La Mano and the southernmost segment of the South Road was powerful, not only given its relationship with Ake Da Nastane, but also as a place where past eras were manifest in the form of fossils, a rock outcrop framed roadway, and traces of Basket Maker era ancestors. Thus, those who walked along the South Road in the Chaco era traversed the same roadway walked by people 4 centuries earlier, a trans-temporal corridor of power. I turn now to questions of the materiality of Chacoan roads, emphasizing 3 elements: the roadbeds themselves, water, and the ceramic sherds frequently found scattered along roadways. Recall the form of Chacoan roads, excavated and therefore concave, linear corridors often lined by earthen berms. In considering the notion that Chacoan roads might have been used for expeditious travel and transport across the San Juan Basin, I began thinking about what aspects of a hypothetical road system would be most conducive to travel across the basin. There are a few topographic obstacles, but as various researchers have pointed out, it is certainly easier to walk along a compacted surface, and in this sense, Chacoan roads would have facilitated movement in the basin. On the other hand, anyone who has spent time in Chaco or its vicinities has likely experienced the transformation of the San Juan Basin's clay-rich soils into a mucky, slippery, highly adhesive mud after rainfall or snowmelt, either in the form of a vehicle sliding precariously across a dirt road or the massive clumps of mud that accumulate on one's footwear, doubling the size of one's feet. The reality of San Juan Basin soils means that Chacoan roads would have been useless any time after rain or snowmelt. If the Chacoans wanted to create an efficient road system, probably the most helpful form would be a paved roadway. And Chacoan architecture makes it clear they had no trouble quarrying, shaping, transporting, and laying stone. And yet the Chacoans did the opposite, creating depressed roadways that would have filled with water and mud, making travel along them extremely difficult. Numerous researchers, such as Chip Wills and Stephen Janes, have noted that the concave form of Chacoan roads would have collected and perhaps channeled water, and they suggest Chacoan roads in some cases served as water management infrastructure. While I've been inspired by their observations, I am less convinced that roads were built to control water. Instead, I wish to highlight that roads would have collected water that would remain pooled along roadways for some time. Why is the fact water would have pooled in Chacoan roads significant? If we think of Chacoan roads as economic infrastructure, the accumulation of water along their lengths becomes a nuisance, an obstacle to efficiency, and a problem to be solved. On the other hand, if we consider water as a powerful and sacred substance, the focus of prayers, dances, supplications, and symbolism in Indigenous Southwestern ceremonialism, we can come to a different understanding. As I will describe shortly, by thinking of Chacoan roads as ritual corridors used for processions, races, and offerings, the accumulation of water in roadways might have been exactly the point. A physical manifestation that the religious practices undertaken on roads were efficacious, with the watery evidence accumulated within the very road corridor where the religious practices took place. Before exploring such practices further, let us consider for a moment the artifacts most commonly found along Chacoan roads, broken pieces of pottery. Ceramics are almost ubiquitous across the archaeological landscapes of the U.S. Southwest, and as archaeologists, we frequently think of ceramics scattered across sites as background noise, a smattering of traces of daily life to be expected amongst the dwellings of past peoples. The ceramics found along Chacoan roadways, however, challenge such notions. Take, for example, a segment of Chaco's Great North Road that I documented as part of my dissertation project. Here, hundreds of ceramic sherds fill the road corridor, 613 sherds within two 250-meter-long segments, to be exact. These ceramic pieces do not mark pot drops. The pieces do not fit back together, and there is no evidence of a settlement within at least 3 miles. The best explanation seems to be that broken sherds were collected prior to ritual movements along roads and sprinkled along the route, with some locations, like the part of the North Road in question, marked by particularly dense accumulations. Thus, such scatters are likely offerings, perhaps serving to mark the road's route along less formalized sections, but certainly incorporating the lively and meaningful essence of vessels as part of the Chacoan roadway. One need look no further than the Grounded in Clay exhibit, curated by Pueblo people and organized by SAR, to glimpse some likely aspects of the significance of pottery sprinkled along Chacoan roads. Ceramics have their own life, hold food and water, embody meaning through their designs, and offer a direct link between their makers and the people in whose lives they were enmeshed. Thus, the ceramic pieces placed onto Chacoan roadways were animate, vibrant matter, the deposition of which likely served as offerings and prayers that afforded the roadway additional power. The preceding discussions highlight the final major focus of my project, the question of what practices took place on Chacoan roads and how they were used. Roads were not simply abstract architecture crafted to be seen from above through aerial photography or represented by millions of laser points, which are the primary ways archaeologists engage with Chacoan roads today, but would have been experienced more slowly at embodied human scales. In particular, 2 ways that the ancestral inhabitants of Chaco experienced the roads stand out: races and processions. We know races are likely to have occurred on Chacoan roads based on Diné traditional knowledge. Oral histories of the great gambler at Chaco make repeated reference to the construction of racetracks at Chaco Canyon and high-stakes races along them. The importance of running in Diné and Pueblo cultures goes far beyond a recreational activity and is often intended to reinforce the primary participants' connection to the fundamental aspects of creation, such as the Diné morning prayer run or the girls' Kenalda puberty ceremony. In Pueblo cultures, racing has potency as a rainmaking ritual. Together, these traditions suggest races in the Chacoan past connected people to the powers of the cosmos, brought rain, were implicated in rites of passage and seasonal transitions, and were wagered upon. Processions, a common aspect of human religious practice around the world, are another aspect of Chacoan road-related rituals. As mentioned earlier, Basket Maker 3 rock art appears to depict processions towards great kivas, and the wide, performative Chacoan roads would have been perfect stages for formalized group movements. Processions can serve as experiences of comunitas, group-wide undertakings that reinforce communal bonds and group identity. A robust literature from social psychology has demonstrated that people moving in unison display increased altruistic behavior, positive affect, and altered perceptions of selfhood, outcomes crucial for building and maintaining large societies, such as Chaco's regional polity. On the other hand, processions also serve as an arena for display and the establishment, perpetuation, and contestation of social inequalities. The order in which participants are lined up, who gets to participate in the procession in the first place, and the adornment and clothing of those participating are often a microcosm of society in its more quotidian forms. Thus, we can see how the ritual movements carried out along roadways served both to reinforce communal bonds, but also to perpetuate the authority and prestige of elites within the Chaco world. I will close with the first part of the title of my dissertation and of this talk. It shows my way, poetically translated from the Diné phrase Bik'eh na sha, according to it I walk, as expressed in a song of Talking God, where the full phrase is, this thing that is beautiful, or hojo, it shows my way. There were immense transformations in Pueblo and Diné societies following the Chaco era, with large-scale migrations, shifting lifeways, the abolishment of overt expressions of hierarchy, and a turn to settlement plans that reinforced, to use the words of the late Rena Swensel of Santa Clara Pueblo, quote, an understated sacredness, end quote, and the centrality of the community rather than monumentality and grandeur. As reviewed at the beginning of this talk, descendant histories emphasize the overaccumulation of, quote, spiritual power and power over people, end quote, at Chaco, a society that became thrown out of balance as powerfully depicted in Diné histories of the great gambler. To leave Chaco was to return to balance, and today, both Diné and Pueblo people conceive of life using imagery of roads. To live a life of hojo, harmony, health, and balance, is, for the Diné, to walk the corn pollen path. Similarly, Ed Ladd of Zuni Pueblo explained that, quote, the Zuni believe that everyone carries within himself his own personal life road, end quote, with Zuni prayers asking, quote, may all reach the end of their roads together in happiness, end quote. In the Chaco era, roads served as stages for religious practices and performances and showed the way to places of power, places that were, returning to the words of Paula Gunn Allen, quote, filled with an intangible but very real power or force, for good or bad, end quote. In the Chaco era, connections with such places were monumentally carved onto the landscape in the form of massive roads, and engagement with such powers seems to have exceeded what was harmonious and balanced. The roads of Chaco, therefore, continue to show the way, marking alignments to highly significant places of great meaning, but also serving as tangible reminders of a history that came before and from which the people learned, adapted, and transformed to become the thriving communities of today. In a contemporary world plagued by rampant inequality, the story of Southwestern Indigenous peoples' rejection of hierarchy following the decline of Chaco stands as a striking example of how societies can reimagine themselves. In so doing, Pueblo and Diné peoples created resilient communities that have weathered centuries of colonial abuse and attempted genocide. Chacoan roads, traces of Indigenous Southwestern history, as well as the broader story of humanity, lead not to some remote past, but to an uncertain, all too familiar present. May the roads of Chaco continue to show our way for another 1,000 years, and even more to come. Thank you.
Wow, Rob, that's great. That was a lot to take in. For folks who are joining us who weren't here at the very beginning, I am Paul Reier. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and here is Rob Weiner in person to answer your questions. Folks, please, if you have a question following this, I see that we have a lot of people watching. If you have any questions come up during the conversation or from the presentation, please type your question into the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen. We have some questions already, so I won't indulge myself with too many of my own comments or questions. But Rob, as a semiotic anthropologist, one of the things that I loved about your project is that you start with a couple of simple words, or we could call those linguistic signs if we wanted to be a semiotician, road, religion. And what you do of course, within the constraints of archaeological practice is to an incredible degree, you really round those out with the context. And I think that's the important thing, that for a long time we've sort of understood semiotically that meaning is not encapsulated within the term itself, road, but within the context and the other conceptual categories around that term matter. Well, how do you get at that archaeologically and in the distant past? It's hard, right? We don't have a full sense of the cultural context of 1,000 years ago. But what you've done is this amazing combination of descendant communities and their conceptual categories that are relevant, and also some from the actual archaeological evidence. I think that was fantastic, and I think that's the strongest approach you could take. And I thought it was very compelling to think about religion in relation to these monumental features. So I just enjoyed that. That's a comment more than a question, but wanted to start with that because I was reminded of one of my favorite phrases in social thought, which is from Roland Barthes. And he once wrote in the 1970s, he wrote in his book, The Fashion System, that meaning is a grace that descends upon the object. You know, meaning is not encapsulated within the notion of road. And you're getting at that. It's contextual. All right, so we have all these great questions, and some of them I think I will have to try to, as I said at the beginning, there are going to be so many, I think we'll have to combine some. We had a question that really I can answer, actually, the first one. Can we see that first quotations page again? Well, thank you, Mark, for that question. This talk is being recorded, and everyone registered will have get an email once it's put on our YouTube page. You'll have a chance to go back and look at it again and pause your screen. Unfortunately, we're live right now, so we couldn't go back or pause for. You did have a few slides that had a lot of text, and I think I didn't get through all of it either. So folks, yes, you can go back and rewatch and pause as you wish in a few days. I don't know exactly how long it'll take to get this up on YouTube. Maybe a week. Excellent presentation. This is from Kimla McDonald. Are you at all hopeful that research such as yours will encourage the BLM to limit energy development in the Chaco Basin?
Well, first, I just want to say thanks, Paul, for your comments starting out. I agree that it's so relational, trying to understand any of these words that are fundamental to my title, to my project, to my dissertation. So I appreciate how you brought out the semiotic aspects. In terms of the question that was raised, certainly, in the last large-scale project documenting Chacoan roads happened in the 1970s and 80s, long before we had the technologies of today. And as many people know, there has been a lot of efforts to stop further energy development in the San Juan Basin, efforts which I generally support. And I think for the landscape to be protected, for land managers to understand, well, what are these archaeologists and activists talking about? Yeah, then we need rich descriptions showing not only what these features are, but how they relate to a larger cultural history. And I mean, my project has shown undoubtedly there are more roads out there than the BLM found in the 70s and 80s. And that's I don't mean any offense to those researchers. They did an incredible job with the technologies of the time, but now, we have LiDAR freely available online. Anybody can basically go find new roads that have been there and undetectable for the last few decades. So I would certainly hope that my work does inspire greater protection of the Chaco landscape.
Great. Question from Jean Pike. Do you know which might have been the oldest road or non-road at Chaco and when it was constructed?
Yes.
This came in before you addressed this, that the Basket Maker 3, that some of them were older, but go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. There's the Yava De La Mano site where it seems pretty clear to me. We have a formalized corridor in Basket Maker 3. There's a few other examples closer to the Chusca Slope, near Tohatchee, and actually a couple near Tohatchee. And then there's, I will mention this incredible site too, which is up in right near the literal Four Corners. It's called the Cross Canyon site, which is a big stone enclosure, some kind of hilltop ceremonial site, it would seem. And that dates to maybe the Archaic period, maybe Basket Maker 2. There's some, nobody knows for sure, but there's a stone-lined avenue emanating out from that feature. So could we really call that Chacoan? Not really, but that is a very early formalized road in the Southwest leading to this sort of non-domestic compound on a striking mesa top that has astronomical associations and so forth. So I think that is probably the earliest road I've seen in the Southwest, but within the Chaco world, I think they're certainly being constructed in Basket Maker 3. And I would, I didn't mention this in the talk, but I would like to emphasize as well that we know Chaco Canyon itself was a big deal in Basket Maker 3. As people have talked about for decades, but sometimes the linkage isn't made between these big sites, Shabik Eshji and 423, with then what later comes in Pueblo Bonito and the large great houses. But these Basket Maker sites were massive. They had astronomical associations, and the idea that building roads might have been an early component of the monumental architecture, I think is not so far-fetched, especially given that the technological and methodological expertise needed to create roads is not like building a 4-story tall building out of stone. You need to be able to dig and engineer a straight line, both of which were certainly within the abilities of Basket Maker peoples. So thanks to the person who asked that question.
We have a question from Tim Kohler. Your conception of Chaco as a religious movement seems very credible to me, but what would have made this religion so compelling that it was able to grow throughout large portions of the San Juan Basin? That's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tim. That's a wonderful question. One where my mind would go immediately is to one place my mind would go is to connections with Mesoamerica. So I'm thinking of a paper I published in 2015, I think, arguing that part of Chaco's ritual allure was having these goods from the Mesoamerican world, birds that could talk to you, this amazing new beverage, cacao, right? Stimulating to the mind, bells made of copper. People would have never seen, engaged with, heard metal before. And then suddenly here is this thing, it's sparkling in the sunlight, it's this brand new substance. And not only is one encountering all these incredible goods, but there are certainly stories of where they're coming from, these unimaginable distances. And somehow these people in Chaco have the ability to go to these distant realms, certainly with some kind of a cosmological charge, and bring back these incredible things. So I think sort of highly sensory performances and gatherings in the canyon involving these very hard to obtain striking goods would have been one component of what made the Chacoan religion so compelling to people. I think the knowledge of astronomy manifested in buildings and certainly brought forth, I would imagine, in certain performances would be another element of that. Those are, I think, the two elements that I would highlight, and it's an amazing question, and hopefully I will have many years ahead to continue investigating it. Thank you.
Here's a question we have a lot of questions coming in, Rob, so let's keep moving as quickly as we can to get as many of them. There are a lot of great questions. Question from John Maraldo. I've read that the Chaco complex was eventually abandoned, at least in part because of the deforestation of nearby areas. Do you know of evidence of deforestation and its effects in the 13th century? Thanks for a great talk.
Thank you. A recent study that came out, I'm not totally up to date on the specifics, but this came out a year or two ago. I think they were using pack rat middens, perhaps. And anyhow, they concluded that Chaco was treeless for thousands of years before the constructions of the great houses. So it's the latest evidence suggests Chaco was never, there was never this remnant Pleistocene forest as was believed a number of decades ago. And it seems like most of the pinon juniper was gone from the canyon even before the sort of great house era occupation. So people were using a lot of trees in the landscape. The population was growing. There were regions all around Chaco, but I think and sure, that is a factor within the depopulation, the lifeway transformations, the migrations. But ultimately, I think it has much more to do with social like many, many other factors: drought, hierarchy, rejection of this religious system, rejection of the elitism, and deforestation of Chaco itself does not seem to have been particularly prominent.
Question from Stephen Freiberg. How do roads interface with the Mogollon people and later the Apache?
That's a very interesting question. I don't, someone out there listening may, but I don't know of any Mogollon roads. I know there's one road documented, I believe, yeah, it's Snaketown in the Hohokam world, in terms of Apache people's connection to constructed roads. That's not something I know about. The construction of these things really was very focused on that Four Corners culture area.
The question from Mark Severson. Above Bonito, to the northwest, there are two stone bowls in the sandstone surface near the edge, a few feet apart. At least one and possibly both are man-made. Do you have any idea what they might signify?
Gosh, I've heard a lot of speculations, but I really don't know. These are what are known as the pecked basins. They're found throughout the Chacoan world. I guess what I would say is that they would certainly collect rainwater. And as I was emphasizing in the presentation, water, the collection of it, of course, is a necessity of life. It's a very important religious element of existence as well here in the arid Southwest. And so, yeah, I don't know really what the pecked basins are, but I think the fact that they would collect water is where my mind would go.
We have a question here from Sarah Newman. Oh, by the way, folks, you can give a thumbs up to questions, and that might help me, as we may have to start jumping around a little bit to see where the most enthusiasm for certain questions comes. This one has some thumbs ups from people. Sarah Newman, thanks for this wonderful presentation, Rob. Can you explain a bit more how you see the roads and their intersection, for example, at the Gasco Herradura, as expressions of power? You moved away from Western ideas of power, Marx, Foucault, etc. But what kind of power do you see being expressed in these road systems and their stopping points? How does Diné power work? Is it power over, power through, or something else entirely?
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the question. Another wonderful and challenging one. So how do the roads specifically relate to power? I mean, what I've attempted to argue and what seems to be happening is that they're building like marking on the landscape alignments towards powerful places or entities, whether that's the solstice sun or a mountain where certain powers and deities reside, and building roads as a sort of infrastructure to channel that potency to then be used to make rainfall, or the various ways that power can be leveraged to create changes in the world in which humans live. So that being, so in one sense, the roads are being built to channel and directly interface with these potencies. Second, it is also, in the more Western sense of power, a vast labor undertaking. I mean, most of these roads are 9 meter wide, they're half a meter deep, people are digging them, and the organization, at certainly, people being put to work is, do we know who was commanding it and so forth. It seems pretty likely that the Chacoan elites were sort of at least designing these things. Maybe part of their prestige was participating in the labor, but it's also, I think, quite likely that large numbers of people were contributing goods, labor, and so forth to those projects. In terms of in the traditions today, is power over, power through, etc. I feel a little bit uncomfortable trying to, as an outsider, answer that directly, but my understanding of it is that the holy people, in a Navajo context, let's say, the holy people have power to make things happen. When a person is being healed, say in a sand painting ceremony, a certain holy person is evoked and arrives and brings that person back into balance. Is that the ceremonialist who's evoking the power of the deity, they don't have power over that deity. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't say either, that the deity has power over the person they're healing. It's sort of a bringing something in, and then the sort of holy people return to their places. So I don't know, and in the societies today, that's not necessarily, it does not seem in contemporary Indigenous cultures that the ability to do that is equated as intensely with political authority as it was in the Chacoan era. Hope that helps answer.
If I could jump ahead, there's a related straightforward question here from Brent Andrews. How long would the roads have remained unusable following a typical rainfall? You're talking about power and rain, and so I thought this would fit.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, I've seen, because of that clay-rich sediment in the San Juan Basin, I've seen puddles stay at least a week, if not longer. You can see this in the cattle tanks out throughout the San Juan Basin and Navajo Nation as well. So the water can stay around for a long time.
Here's a question that's gotten a lot of responses, thumbs up from people. So this is a tough one. From Anne Broudis. My understanding is that the ancestors of the Navajos did not move into the Four Corners area until after the decline of Chaco. Do I have this wrong, or are you rejecting this theory?
Cool. Yeah, one of my favorite topics. So there's a long-standing narrative within Southwestern archaeology, Southwestern history, that sees Navajo people as latecomers, migrants from the Alaska area circa 1500. Navajo today, the language is an Athabascan language related to what is spoken up in Alaska, and yet it's a much more nuanced and complicated situation. I always say we're very sophisticated and careful with conversations about identity as anthropologists until it comes to the question of Navajo origins, because it's usually they're latecomers, they weren't here in the Southwest, what do they know about Chaco? Well, what I've learned from working with Navajo people is that it really comes down to the histories of specific clans. So if you ask a Navajo person, who are you? They will tell you their clans. Each of those clans has a particular history, a particular origin story of how the clan came to be. And at least a third of those clans originated at well-known sites in the Chaco world, what they would call Anasazi sites, or ancestral Puebloan, ancestral Four Corners sites. Other Navajo people, the Western Water clans, will say, yeah, we were not here in that Chaco era, we had nothing to do with that. So it's really comes down to the histories of specific clans, and the oral histories are so rich. And additionally, Navajo people are the ones still living in the landscape of the Chaco world. This isn't to deny the connections Pueblo people have to those sites as well. And yet through daily interaction, being right next to these places, Navajo people have curated many stories about them that have lots and lots of detail as well. So I would say undoubtedly there were ancestors of people who are today called Navajos in the Chaco era. There were ancestors of people today who are called Pueblo in the Chaco era. And the late arrival narrative, I'll just say one more thing about this and then we'll go to the next question. But in, for example, the Navajo origin story, they talk about in that time period of Chaco, there were settled people and there were mobile people. The current archaeological understandings, we only talk about settled. It's sort of like maize came to the Southwest and everybody was sedentary. And yet in these Navajo stories, they say, no, there were people who were hunting and gathering, occupying more mountainous areas during the Chaco era. And those people would, our current archaeological paradigms makes no space to even identify hunter-gatherer sites from, say, the Chaco era. And so I think that's another distinction, that there were probably people continuing more nomadic lifeways from the Chaco era into later periods of history that have been missed. So could go on and on and on, but I hope that helped clarify. And I'll say one more thing, which is I would highly recommend Clara Kelly and Harris Francis's recent book, A Diné History of Navajo Land, for further and nuanced discussion of Diné connections to the Chaco era.
I think Shakespeare said this best, Rob. There are more things to heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our categories of them. And you're getting at that. There are a lot of questions here that are short. So if I may, anonymous attendee, will you be publishing a text on your work? I assume the answer is yes, of course. The dissertation is a public thing. And then hopefully, I hope you will publish a book out of that. So moving on, can you define the word herradura again, from Cecilia Noel?
Yes, this happens every talk.
Yeah.
It's a Spanish word. Herradura means horseshoe. That's because these are crescent horseshoe-shaped masonry structures found along Chacoan roads. They're the main kind of structure you find along roads. Again, crescent-shaped masonry structures. They're always on almost always on high points with sweeping views in many directions. You often get broken pottery offerings alongside them as well. And for another day, we'll save the story of how they got that name.
Can you next question, sorry, from Julia Appletree. When do you think the best time of year to visit this site?
Best time of year to visit Chaco Canyon itself, I am quite partial to October, September, October. It's not going to be too hot or too cold yet. I personally love the heat, so I love being there in July when it's over 100, but I wouldn't recommend that to others.
So here you have a question. We have a question from your dissertation committee from Scott Ortman. Hello, Scott, former SAR fellow as well. Thanks, Rob. Do you think there were particular times of year when specific practices occurred? Can you tell? I'm wondering in particular about the connections between racing and the seasons and weather. So another seasonal question.
Hi, Scott. Thank you. Yes, I think that one way to begin approaching that question, and one way I'm doing so in my dissertation, is looking at the alignment of the roads. So for example, the Gasco Road, which is lining up towards the winter solstice sunrise, I think that road would almost certainly have been the ritual movements and offerings and practices and races would have taken place around winter solstice. Thinking to another site like Pueblo Pintado, where the road is aligned to the summer solstice sunset, that's probably taking place at that time of year. There's also a lot of indication in Navajo oral histories that roads also relate to particular constellations that would have a seasonal associations. And so I think the astronomy ties into that, and certainly the rainfall too, when a race would be run. Sometimes, right, in the races have to do with solstices too, speeding up the sun in its turn the other direction. or bringing the rain, which would pool in the road. So I think there's a lot to do with seasonal associations. The main way I'm approaching that is through, right now, is through orientation.
Here's another question with a lot of enthusiasm from Ted Presler. What are the best guesses of the origins of the elite of Chaco? Rob, you have time for some more questions? It's 12 minutes after 3. We still have a bunch more, but you're still game. Give me a sense of time here.
Yeah, that's okay. I've got my.
Okay, another 10 minutes, perhaps.
Yeah,
okay.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. Again, so what are the best guesses of the origins of the elite of Chaco?
That's a very, it's a great question, a difficult question. I can talk about the proposals that are out there. I mean, the sort of go-to in the Southwest is that, oh, they had access to good farmland. And sure, that may have had something to do with it. I am one of those who, based on the evidence available, sees Chaco not as such a great agricultural spot. And I would have a lot of trouble, imagining that Chacoan elites, that their prestige first arose because they had a large maize surplus. I find it much more likely that these people, we could think about a concept like charisma, right? That these people had some kind of special knowledge, some kind of special abilities. We know that some people are just born this way, in the sense of, I might call it a religious visionary, someone whose dreams are very vivid and they can manifest the ability that they're connected to certain powers, certain beings, certain realms. Maybe these people had some, ties to people far away in Mesoamerica. It doesn't seem like the earliest elites came from Mesoamerica. That's been proposed by others as well. Certainly in Diné histories, the early, the gambler came from the south, which in and of itself has interesting implications. So, I think it's probably a variety of things, but I would tend to think that, based on what the descendant histories say, those early elites' power had to do with the fact that they had great skill and prowess in connecting with powerful forces and entities.
Okay, another question. Let me jump to this. Amazing work this is a question from Jane Stone. As a non-specialist, what is the time depth and spatial distribution of Diné occupational history in the area? And this might be something you've already addressed, but
I think it's almost too much to try to get into in this Q&A period. The boundaries of I can say this, the boundaries of the Navajo Nation today are almost exactly the boundaries of the Chaco world, about the size of Ohio. When the earliest Navajo ancestors were here, I think is like asking when the earliest indigenous, some of them were indigenous Southwestern populations. Some probably were involved in this migration down from Alaska. When did that happen? Latest thinking is that was triggered by a volcanic eruption happening in the 900s. I think it's either the 800s or the 900s, so it could be as early as that, but maybe they had pre-existing ties to the Southwest if they chose to migrate in mass to this region. You probably are going to migrate somewhere where you have pre-existing connections. The work of Jack Ives at University of Alberta has been very prescient and really cutting edge on Promontory Cave, which is an assemblage from the 1200s near the Salt Lake. Undoubtedly Apachean speaking mobile peoples who are living there by the 1200s. There's increasing evidence of promontory style, meaning Apachean style moccasins from Southwestern collections at Mesa Verde, at Aztec ruins, So the connections are there in the Southwest of Apachean speaking people from far to the north by at least the 1200s. And again, it's a identity that's not quite so easily put into categories.
I'm going to jump ahead. Some of these questions are starting to overlap a little, and I hope maybe we'll have time to come back. Question from Wenda Trevathan. Are any of the roads incorporated into descendant community ritual today, as some of the other geographical features are, such as Mount Taylor?
Hi, Wenda. Thanks for your question. I guess I can say what I know, and I know that some Navajo people undertake, perform ceremonies associated with Chacoan roads. And I've seen very clear material evidence of that during my fieldwork. Of course, that doesn't go into my dissertation, but I have observed that. I would imagine it's the same for Pueblo folks. I don't know as much about that, but I would not be surprised.
I'm going to combine the next two questions from Amanda Williams and from Brad Carlson. Amanda asks, what are the indicators that Chaco was important in Basket Maker 3? And then Brad asks, what about comparable ritual or astronomical roads elsewhere in Mesoamerica or elsewhere comparisons? So compare Basket Maker 3 and then other comparative thinking about roads.
Got it. So what made Chaco important in Basket Maker 3? Mm-hmm. The two biggest settlements around are in Chaco Canyon on the two ends of the canyon. One at Xabik-Esche, or known as Xabik-Eshi in the anglicized form, and one at 423 near current Peñasco Blanco. Both of those, let's take Xabik. It's got an oversized pit structure. It's got a house that seems like it's a religious specialist or an elite. And both sites are positioned with astronomical significance. For more about this, I wrote a paper with Clara Kelly, published in 21 in the journal Kiva, called Azdzan Naho de Dahe, or later Lady Picker Up at Chaco Canyon. I would recommend, we have a lot in there, but Steve Lexon has written about this as well. So basically there were giant settlements there with astronomical significance. The biggest settlements around in Basket Maker 3 were in Chaco, in the San Juan Basin. Comparative roads, yeah, that's one of my favorite subjects. I have a chapter in my dissertation of comparative examples from Mesoamerica and more broadly across the ancient world. So among the Maya, right, roads are called sacbe, the white roads. They were raised causeways, so they wouldn't fill with water. And at least within the colonial contact period sources, they seem to have been used especially for processions. And very frequently Maya roads lead into the civic ceremonial core. They're not so much connecting settlements, but many more of them are connecting different parts of a settlement to the ceremonial core with pyramids and so forth. And there's a rich symbolism of Maya roads. There's of course the roads of La Quemada, which I'm investigating right now. Those also seem to be leading to important ritual places. And I think another really compelling comparison that I bring forth in my dissertation are the Seke systems of Peru in the Inca Empire, which was a series of sometimes just conceptual lines, sometimes constructed pathways between the capital at Cusco and Huacas, which were basically places of power, large rock formations or other places that were considered to have a lot of animate power and force. So I think those are, there's a lot of, it's a very human thing to build roadways as part of ritual architecture, to move along them in groups, and the symbolism related to life, to death, to the sky, to astronomy is rich and very cross-cultural.
We have a question from Evelyn Billow. It's showing up as from Robert Mark, but Chaco has Atlatl Cave, an archaic Basket Maker 2, if I recall. Are there roads or non-roads associated with it?
I do not know of any roads associated with Atlatl Cave. I haven't looked.
The next book. Question from Scott Robinson. Will you elaborate on how sherds are an animated part of a road's use?
Yeah, certainly. So what I'm trying to get at in that aspect of my work is that as archaeologists, or let's say as members of non-indigenous culture in the Southwest, we probably think of potsherds as trash or like inanimate stuff that broke. What I tried to show through those quotes from the current wonderful Grounded in Clay exhibit at MIAC, that SAR put together, all curated by Pueblo people, is that pots have so much more meaning. They're very frequently seen as being alive, as having deep significance and power. They're not just sort of the way we think of inanimate stuff. And so, you know, the question has been, why are there hundreds of sherds scattered on a road way away from, far away from any settlement? One idea is that, well, they just gathered a bunch of trash and they put it there to sort of mark the road in a place that it might have been hard to see. Sure, that's possible, but I'm trying to emphasize that very, very likely within the minds of the people of the Chaco culture, within the minds of indigenous people, pots are something very alive and animate, and they maintain that importance and that significance when they're broken. So I hope that helps clarify.
So here's a question from Joyce Clark, which a lot of people have given a thumbs up. So I'm trying to wrap up here. I'm sorry we're jumping a little, but my gosh, you've got a lot of enthusiasm for your work. So you told of a Basket Maker 3 connections with Chaco. What was it about Chaco Canyon that led to its being chosen for this sacred, powerful place? Other places may have had astronomical sightlines and advantages, so why Chaco?
The $1 million question, or the million turquoise bead question. Well, I guess I would challenge the asker a little bit and say, there actually aren't a lot of, within the San Juan Basin, there's not another canyon with the particular topographic orientation towards astronomical, things like the lunar standstill that you have at Chaco. You don't, something else I'm thinking about recently and have an article in the works about is the fact of the stone cliffs of Chaco. Those are quite, within the San Juan Basin, you don't get these towering sandstone cliffs, but there they are at Chaco. And Pueblo Bonito was built right at the base of what's known as, threatening rock. This huge rock that's being detached from the cliff. The rock was, the rock was probably animate, alive, very significant. And you don't get those kind of sandstone cliffs elsewhere in the San Juan Basin. You don't get a canyon aligned to the moon and the sun, depending on where you're standing, elsewhere in the San Juan Basin. And then you have these relationships at a large scale. This is especially drawing from things I learned from Anna Sofer. If you go due north from Chaco on the North Road, you get to Kutz Canyon, this dramatic Badlands topography. If you go south from Chaco, there's Ake da Nastane, Hasta Butte, sitting there on top of the Dutton Plateau. You've got these amazing landforms in the cardinal directions. And also Chaco is, I could go on forever about this. Chaco is in the center of the basin. So it's ringed, the basin is ringed by mountains and high points. Mountains and high points are where the clouds gather, where the rain falls. So standing atop a high point in Chaco on a summer day, you see the rain clouds everywhere around you. It's almost as if they're being sent out from Chaco. So I think there are a lot of, one more. When it rains very heavily in the San Juan Basin, waterfalls come pouring off the cliffs into Chaco. That is an incredible sensory experience that you don't experience elsewhere in the San Juan Basin. So I think at times it is this incredible watery place. It's a center place within the basin. It's got these cliffs, it's got astronomy. There's the amphitheater, which in Navajo tradition is very significant for why Chaco was chosen where it is. That's said to be, again, using the framework I've been sharing in this talk, a place of power. So maybe we'll take one more.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest, actually. And it's a maybe a good follow-on from this one, and that this one comes from Jane Stone. Could water accumulation also have served as water sources for people traversing the roads?
I've thought about that. I think it would probably get way too silty and muddy from gathering in the roads. Maybe, if there's one thing I'm not, it's a water management in the Southwest expert, but I think the water accumulating in the roads would have gotten pretty mucky and silty and probably not been great for drinking. I think they would have been much better off collecting it in ceramic vessels or in sort of big, places in the bedrock, in the bedrock. What is it? Locis. Yeah.
Like those sandstone bowls that you talked about earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, again, folks watching, thank you so much for sticking with us. There are a few other questions we will try to, kind of give you a chance to go back to, and folks, please keep your eye on Rob's future work. There's a lot more coming, and we're really excited to have you here this year. Excited to have you finish the dissertation and move on and continue to do great work. So thanks for this talk. Thank you everyone for watching. Remember, we will have a link sent to you to watch the entire talk again in the future. Usually takes about a week, depending. Of course, we have the holidays coming up, so I can't promise that, but pretty soon you'll get a link to this talk. And Rob, thank you again. So with that, everyone, this concludes the 2022 to 2023 Colloquium series here at SAR. Come back next fall for the next round, and please keep an eye on Rob Weiner's future work as an archaeologist of the Southwest and of Chaco. Rob, take care. We'll catch you later.
Thank you so much.
All right,
thanks everybody.
You. Take care. Bye-bye.